The envelope was still in my coat pocket when my brother's wife started filming. She had her phone angled up at the chandelier in our parents' dining room like she was capturing some milestone for her followers, and she was narrating in that bright, fake whisper she uses when she wants everyone to know she's being authentic. "We're celebrating a really hard family decision tonight," she said into the camera, "and I just want to say how proud I am of everyone for handling this with so much grace." My brother was standing behind her with a bottle of Prosecco he'd brought from his car. The notary had already left. The dining room smelled like the lasagna my brother's wife had picked up from the place near the courthouse, and the documents I had signed were sitting in a folder on the sideboard where she'd put them as soon as the notary closed his briefcase. I had been home from the cemetery for about 90 minutes. My brother poured a glass for his wife and one for himself, and then, after a moment of theatrical consideration, one for me, which he set on the table without making eye contact. He raised his glass. "To Dad," he said. "To closure." My brother's wife raised her glass and said, "To family," and they clinked, and they both took a sip. And my brother's wife turned the camera around to face herself and said something to her followers about how grief looks different for everyone. And that was when her phone started buzzing in her hand with an incoming call that made her face do something I had been waiting 14 months to see. The screen said her attorney's name. She answered it because she was used to her phone bringing her good news. His voice came through the speaker loud enough that I could hear it from across the table. "Where are you right now?" he said. "Has she signed?" "Tell me she hasn't signed." My brother's wife opened her mouth and closed it again. "Listen to me," the attorney said. "There is a clause. I am looking at it right now. I should have caught it. Do not let her leave with anything. Do not let her notarize anything. If she is already signed, we have a serious problem." My brother put his glass down so hard the Prosecco sloshed onto the tablecloth, the one my mother had embroidered the year I was born. He turned to look at me. I was still in my coat. I had not taken a sip of the Prosecco. I met his eyes across the table and I did not look away, and I watched his face arrive at the understanding that I had not been the person he thought I was, for some time now. I should back up. My father was diagnosed in the second week of October 2 years ago. Glioblastoma, which is a word I had never said out loud before that month, and which I now say with the casual fluency of someone who has filled out 3 different hospice intake forms. The neurologist used the phrase limited window, the way doctors do when they want to be honest without being cruel. And I remember nodding and writing it down in the little notebook I had started carrying. And I remember walking out into the parking structure and sitting in my car for 40 minutes before I could turn the key. I am the younger sibling by 6 years. My brother is an orthopedic sales rep who lives 40 minutes from our parents' house in Sandpoint, Idaho, and I am a forensic auditor for a regional credit union network, which is to say I spend my professional life reading documents that other people have constructed to obscure something, and I am very good at noticing the gaps. Within a month, our parents downstairs had been rearranged around a hospital bed and a tray table and a small white pharmacy of liquid medications I learned to draw up by milliliters. My mother had passed 4 years earlier from a stroke, and so the caregiving fell to me by default, and then by habit, and then, eventually, by something that started to feel like contract. I gave notice to my landlord in Spokane and I moved into my childhood bedroom with 2 suitcases and my work laptop. My employer let me go remote. I built a medication schedule on the inside of the pantry door with a dry erase marker. I learned which pharmacist at the Walgreens on Highway 95 would expedite a refill when I called before 9 in the morning. I learned that my father liked the lemon popsicles, but only the ones from the brand with the green box. I learned how to lift a grown man from a wheelchair to a toilet without injuring either of us. I learned a lot of things in 14 months. My brother visited every other weekend at first, and then once a month, and then, in the last stretch, only when his wife had something she wanted documented. She would arrive with a tote bag of what she called meaningful little things, a candle, a framed photograph she had ordered from one of those vintage print sites, a hand-poured ceramic mug she had bought from a small business she wanted to support, and she would set them up around my father's bed and take pictures of herself holding his hand. My father, in his lucid hours, called her by the wrong name twice and then stopped trying. He called me kiddo until he stopped speaking, which was 3 weeks before the end. My brother's actual contribution The one I want to be precise about, because precision is the whole point of this story, was to stand in the kitchen on his visits and read the medical bills out loud in a tone of personal grievance. "Are you serious?" he would say, holding up an invoice from the durable medical equipment company. "They charged us for the second oxygen tank already." Us was a generous pronoun. He never paid for any of it. The bills came out of my father's account, and when my father's account ran thin in month 9, out of mine. I never asked my brother for a contribution because I knew what asking would cost me, and because I had already started, somewhere around month 7, to notice things. I noticed, for example, that my brother's wife had begun referring to the house as the property in conversations she did not know I could hear. I noticed that she had taken 3 of my mother's rings from the velvet box in the upstairs dresser, the box my father had specifically asked me to keep closed until after, and that when I asked her about it, she said she had taken them for safekeeping because she was worried about the cleaning lady. We did not have a cleaning lady. I noticed that my brother had started asking my father, in the brief windows when my father was alert, whether he had thought about simplifying things before it became complicated for the kids. My father, who had been a probate paralegal for 31 years before he retired, would look at my brother with an expression I cannot fully describe and would say, in his thinned voice, that everything had already been simplified and that the trust was the trust, and that he had made his decisions when his mind was his own. My father died on a Wednesday morning in the second week of December. The funeral was the following Saturday. The reception was at the house. My brother's wife had taken charge of the catering without consulting me, which was fine, and had also taken the opportunity to walk 3 different relatives through the upstairs rooms while narrating what she planned to do with the space, which was less fine. I stood in the kitchen and accepted condolences from my father's old colleagues, and I held a plate of food I did not eat. And at some point in the late afternoon, my brother and his wife cornered me near the laundry room and presented me with what they called a difficult conversation. The difficult conversation, as it turned out, was a manila folder. Inside the folder were what my brother's wife described as the realities. There was a printout that purported to be a county tax notice showing $41,000 of unpaid back taxes on the Sandpoint house. There was a printout that purported to be a letter from a private lender showing a second mortgage my father had supposedly taken out in his final year. There was a printout of what looks like a medical billing statement showing $173,000 owed to a hospice agency. There were highlighted figures in red ink and an aura of catastrophe that had been constructed, I could tell immediately, by someone who had spent more time on the visual presentation than on the underlying documents. My brother's wife explained, in a tone that managed to be both tearful and brisk, that they had consulted with an attorney, and that the attorney had told them the only way to protect the family from the cascading debt was for me to sign an inheritance waiver releasing my claim on the estate so that my brother could absorb the liability under his name and his credit. She put her hand on my arm when she said the word family. My brother stood slightly behind her with his arms crossed and said nothing. I told them I needed time. I told them I was tired. I told them my father had been in the ground for 3 hours and I could not think about paperwork right now. And I watched my brother's wife rearrange her face into an expression of wounded understanding. And I went upstairs and locked my bedroom door, and I sat on the edge of the bed I had slept in as a teenager, and I looked at the wallpaper my mother had picked out in 1996, and I felt something inside me click into a position it had been moving toward for a while. I opened my work laptop. I pulled up the county recorder's public database, which I had access to through a professional subscription I maintained for compliance work. I searched the parcel. There were no liens. There was no second mortgage. The tax bill for the previous year had been paid in full in April. I pulled up the state's business registry and searched the name of the private lender on the printout. The entity did not exist. I called a contact of the hospice agency the next morning, a woman named Tilda Marin who had been one of my father's case coordinators and who liked me because I had brought her coffee on the bad days, and I read her the figure on the billing statement and she went quiet for a moment and then said, "Honey, our balance on his account is $1,400 and that's just the copay we haven't processed yet." The folder was fiction. The whole thing. Every page. I want to tell you what I felt when I confirmed that, because I think it matters. I did not feel rage. Rage would have been cleaner. What I felt was a kind of slow gray nausea, The way you feel when you realize a person you have known your entire life is a stranger to you in some fundamental way, and probably has been for years. My brother and I shared a bathroom for the first 18 years of my life. He taught me how to ride a bike. He came to my college graduation. He held my hand at our mother's funeral. And he had spent the months of our father's dying, not at the bedside but in some other room with his wife, building a folder of fake documents designed to take from me the one inheritance my father had explicitly told me, in writing and out loud and in front of his attorney, that he wanted me to have. I did not call him. I did not confront them. I went for a drive. I drove out past the lake, and I pulled into the parking lot of a hardware store on the south end of town. And I sat in my car with the engine running, and I thought about what I knew about my brother's wife. I thought about the way she had been narrating our family on her phone for 2 years. I thought about the way she had said the property. I thought about the rings. I thought about the lender that did not exist. And I thought about the trust document my father had walked me through 8 months before he died, when his hands were still steady enough to hold a pen. And I remembered a clause he had pointed to and tapped with his finger. "Listen to this part," he had said. "Your grandfather put this in the original instrument and I kept it. Anyone who tries to take from another beneficiary through fraud or coercion forfeits their share." He had looked at me over his glasses. "I am telling you about this because I want you to know it exists. I am not telling you because I think you will need it." He had paused. "But I want you to know it exists." I drove home. I went to a small electronics store on Cedar Street and I bought a digital voice recorder, the kind with no Wi-Fi, no cloud, no nothing, just a small black rectangle with a single LED and a micro SD slot. I tested it in my car. I tested it again in my coat pocket. I called my brother that evening and I told him in a tired, thinned voice that I had been thinking about what they said and that I wanted to meet, just the three of us, at the house, to walk through the folder one more time before I made any decisions. I told him I was scared. I told him I did not understand all of it. I told him I needed them to explain it to me again because my head was not clear. My brother's wife arrived first. She brought a bakery box and a bottle of wine. She hugged me longer than was necessary and she told me she was so glad I had reached out, that she had been worried about me, that grief did strange things to people and she wanted to make sure I felt supported. My brother arrived 20 minutes later. The recorder was in the front pocket of my cardigan, against my sternum, where the fabric was thick enough to muffle the soft mechanical click of the on switch. We sat at the dining room table. My brother's wife opened the folder. For the next 90 minutes, on a recording I still have, my brother's wife walked me through every fabricated page of that folder and explained in increasingly specific terms why I needed to sign. She named the supposed attorney they had consulted. She named the supposed lender. She read aloud in a voice intended to convey reluctant gravity the figures she had invented. When I asked, with what I hope was convincing fragility, what would happen if I refused to sign, she told me, and this is the part I keep going back to, that my brother would pursue legal action against me for the medical expenses he had paid during my father's illness. She used the figure $140,000. My brother nodded along. He did not correct her. When I asked, almost in a whisper, whether there was any way to share the burden, she touched my hand and told me that the only way to protect the family legacy was for one of us to absorb the risk, and that since my brother had the more stable financial position, it had to be him. She said the more stable financial position twice. She did not know I had pulled my brother's credit report through a soft permission flag at work. She did not know that I knew about the second loan against his truck. She did not know I knew their household had been late on their mortgage 4 times in the last calendar year. I sat at that table and I let her finish. I asked clarifying questions designed to elicit specific admissions. I asked her to confirm the name of the lender, which she did. I asked her to confirm the amount of the tax delinquency, which she did. I asked my brother to confirm the medical expenses he had personally paid, and he did, and he named a hospital network my father had never been admitted to. The recorder, against my chest, captured every syllable. At the end of the 90 minutes, I wiped my eyes and I told them I would sign whatever they wanted me to sign. My brother's wife said, "Oh, sweetheart," and hugged me. My brother said, "You're doing the right thing." They left the folder on the table. The notary appointment was 3 days later. The notary was a man named Pelham, a friend of my brother's wife's, which was its own data point, and he came to the house with his stamp in his journal. My brother's wife had prepared the waiver herself using a template she had clearly downloaded, and the language was almost adequate, which is to say it would have held up against a person who did not read carefully but would not survive any sustained scrutiny. I read every page. I signed every page. I initialed where I was supposed to initial. The notary stamped and signed. My brother's wife let out a small involuntary sound of relief that I will not forget. She put the folder of executed documents on the sideboard. The notary packed up his kit. He shook my hand. He told me he was sorry for my loss. He left. There is a window of approximately 11 minutes in this story that I am proud of. It is the window between the moment the notary's car pulled out of the driveway and the moment my brother opened his bottle of Prosecco. In those 11 minutes, while my brother's wife was in the kitchen unboxing the lasagna and arranging plates on a tray she had brought specifically for the occasion, I went upstairs to change out of my funeral clothes, which is what I had said I needed to do. I went into my childhood bedroom. I closed the door. I opened my laptop. I had already prepared the email. I attached the audio file from the recorder, which I had transferred and backed up to 2 separate encrypted drives that morning. I attached the certified copies of the trust instrument with the forfeiture clause highlighted. I attached the public records showing no liens, no second mortgage, and the paid tax bill. I attached the letter from Tilda Marin at the hospice agency confirming the actual balance. I attached scans of my brother's wife's text messages from the last 6 weeks, including the one where she had used the phrase, "Get her to sign before she gets curious." I had been forwarding her texts to a private archive since week 3 of October. I sent the email to 3 recipients. The first was my father's estate attorney, a man my father had used for 20 years, who had drafted the trust and who knew the forfeiture clause was in there because he had advised my father to keep it. The second was the senior partner at the firm my brother's wife had claimed to consult, a firm that, I had confirmed by phone, had no record of either of them as clients, and which took a dim view of being invoked falsely. The third was the county prosecutor's office, to a specific assistant DA I had worked with on a forensic audit case 2 years earlier, who handled financial crimes and who had told me at the time to call her if I ever needed her. I closed my laptop. I came downstairs. I put my coat back on because I had told my brother I wanted to take a short walk before we ate. My brother's wife had set out 3 glasses. She was filming. The chandelier was on. The bottle was being uncorked. The phone rang. I have replayed her face in my head 100 times. The way her mouth opened around the word "what?" The way she said, "I'm sorry, can you say that again?" The way her attorney's voice, on speaker, got louder and faster and started using the phrase "get the document back" and the phrase "immediately" and the phrase "Vivian, listen to me." I had not realized until that moment that her attorney called her by a nickname. She had introduced herself to me by her full name for 15 years. I think it was the nickname that broke her composure because it placed her, in the recording, in a different relationship than the one she had performed for me. My brother set down the bottle. He looked at me. I looked at him. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment because I think it matters and because I do not want this story to be misread. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the strange, hollowed out, almost queasy quiet of a person who has just confirmed something terrible about the people who raised her. I felt my father's absence very acutely. I felt, for the first time since the diagnosis, like I might actually be able to sit down for a while. My brother's wife was still on the phone, her free hand braced against the edge of the table, her phone still recording on the tripod, capturing herself in real time, receiving the worst professional news of her life. My brother said my name. I did not answer him. I walked past the table and I picked up the folder of executed documents from the sideboard because I am a careful person and because evidence is evidence, and I walked out the front door. The court hearing happened 13 weeks later. The waiver was set aside on the grounds of fraud in the inducement, which is a phrase I now know how to use confidently. The audio recording, supported by the documentary evidence and the false statements made on it, was admitted without serious objection from my brother's new attorney, who had taken over after the first one filed a motion to withdraw. The forfeiture clause in the original trust was triggered. My brother's share of the estate was extinguished entirely. His wife was named in a separate civil action by the firm she had falsely invoked. The notary, Pelham, faced a disciplinary inquiry from the state commissioning authority for failing to verify the underlying representations, which is a technicality but a real one. The assistant DA I had emailed referred the matter to her office's Economic Crimes Unit for review of potential charges related to the fabricated documents and the elder financial exploitation, which is a specific statutory category in our state. I do not know yet what will come of that referral. I am told these things take time. My brother called me twice in the weeks after the hearing. I did not pick up. He left no message either time. His wife sent a long email that I read once and then archived without responding. It contained the phrases, "Family means more than this," and "Dad would have wanted, and I think you need help." And I want to say, just for the record, that I do need help, and I am getting it, and the help is not the kind she meant. I have been seeing a therapist on Thursday afternoons. She is a calm woman in her 60s who told me at our second session that grief and clarity can occupy the same room and that I should not be alarmed if they do. I have found that useful. I used a portion of the estate to pay off the credit card I ran up during the last 6 months of my father's care. I used another portion to buy a small house on a quiet street in a town an hour and a half from Sandpoint, in a county where I do not have a history with anyone, and I have started, very slowly, to plant a garden in the side yard. I kept the rings my brother's wife took from the velvet box, which were returned to me by court order, and I have not worn them yet. But I take them out sometimes and look at them and think about my mother and about how she would have handled all of this, which is honestly not very differently than I did. I am going to ask you something, and I mean it the way I would ask a person sitting next to me on a long flight, which is to say I am not looking for the right answer, I am looking for an honest one. If the people who were supposed to stand next to you at the worst moment of your life turned out to be the ones engineering the next worst moment, how long would it take you to see it? And once you saw it, what kind of person would you decide to be? I am still figuring out the second part. The first part took me about 7 months. I think, in the end, I am someone who reads the documents. I think I am someone who keeps the recorder in her pocket. I think I am someone who, when she is told by people she loves that the family legacy depends on her silence, finds herself, very quietly, going for a drive. I have thought a lot, in the months since the hearing, about how a person arrives at a moment like the one I had at that dining room table. Not the moment when the phone rang. The earlier one. The one in my childhood bedroom when I sat on the bed and decided what kind of person I was going to be for the next 11 minutes, and, really, for the rest of my life. Because that was the actual decision. Everything after it was just execution. My brother did not become the man who built a folder of fake documents overnight. He became him slowly, over years of small choices that nobody, including me, was paying close enough attention to. He learned, somewhere along the way, that performing concern was cheaper than feeling it. His wife learned, somewhere along the way, that a phone in her hand was a kind of armor against being seen clearly. And our father, in the meantime, was dying in a room down the hall while I learned how to draw morphine by milliliters. The cause and the effect were already in motion before I picked up the recorder. I just made them visible. What I want to say, if I can say it without sounding like I am instructing anyone, is that the people who hurt you the worst are often counting on a specific version of you to show up at the table. A tired version. A grieving version. A version who is too exhausted to read the documents and too kind to question the people offering her wine. They build their whole plan around her. And the work, the actual work, is not revenge. It is refusing to be that version of yourself when it matters. It is sitting in your car in a hardware store parking lot and asking yourself, honestly, what you already know. It is pulling up the public records. It is calling Tilda Marin on a Tuesday morning. It is being willing to be wrong about people you love, which is the hardest part, and being willing to be right about them, which is harder. I do not think of what I did as cleverness. I think of it as homework. My father spent 31 years reading documents other people wanted him to skim, and he raised a daughter who did the same thing, and when the test came, I was already prepared because I had been preparing my entire life without knowing it. That is what character is, I think. It is the version of you that shows up when nobody is watching and the stakes are real. Donovan and Brielle had a version of themselves they performed for the camera. I had a quieter one that I had been building, page by page, for years. If there is anything I would tell a person standing where I stood, it is this. Do not confuse softness with weakness. Do not confuse patience with permission. And do not let anyone, not your brother, not his wife, not the person who taught you how to ride a bike, convince you that your clarity is the thing tearing the family apart. The family was already torn. You are just the one who turned on the light.